Hello, everyone. Parting is such sweet sorrow. This is our final session of the day where we're going to focus on how regulators can deal with the ever increasing use of technology and innovation across all sectors. Now, there is a clear shift among the public, with many people now not just preferring but demanding that they can access services digitally or in an innovative way. The Office for National Statistics, for instance, reports that 96% of people now have internet access at home, and over 80% shop around or access services online regularly. But at the same time, as many move to new ways of working, we cannot lose sight of the fact that technology is not for everyone. So whose role is it to make sure the digitally excluded don't become further isolated? Really important points. So we're going to discuss all this with our final brilliant panel of the day. Stephen Almond is Director of Technology and Innovation at the Information Commissioner's Office. Stefan Hunt is Chief Data and Digital Officer at the Competition and Markets Authority. Mick McAteer is founder and co-director of the Financial Inclusion Centre. Professor Suzanne Rabb is from Searle Court Chambers, and Tracy Vegro, Executive Director, Strategy and Innovation at the SRA. It's great to see you all. Thank you for joining us. Full biographies of all our panelists are available on the link just below the video screen there. And we really want to hear from you. We want you to be involved in this session and make it really interactive. So if you've got a question, click on the Q&A link below this video to ask your question and your query. And of course, there's always the Twitter sphere at #Reg Futures. You can get in touch with us there. So, hello, panel.
Hello, Clive.
It's great to see you.
Clive.
Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate your time. Now, I think I'm going to ask a general question of all of you. And I want you to think about what the main opportunities or challenges are for regulation that the growth of technology and innovation has actually posed. Suzanne. Suzanne, you're on mute, unfortunately. There you go. Brilliant.
Right, commit the first serial webinar offence of the day before we even get started, and perhaps that is
time.
yes, maybe that is the biggest technology challenge we all face, which is marrying our rational intentions with our more irrational ones. But I think the biggest challenge is the information asymmetry or deficit we find ourselves in, where there is the temptation for technology to be allowed to deliver the great benefits that we envisage and do not constrain it, against the risk of leaving interventions too late, and by that time we cannot correct for the failures that have achieved. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we face.
Mick, opportunities or challenges for regulation and technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there are clearly opportunities for regulators here. You know, there's no question about it. Digital and data services have brought great benefits to a lot of people. You know, it's just so much easier to make appointments, buy goods and services. So I think an opportunity for regulators is really to try and encourage what we would call socially useful innovation. But again, but the corollary of that, and I have to say, I'm an Ulster-man, as you can tell from the accent. Whenever we see a silver lining, we look for the clouds, you know, and there's plenty of clouds on the technology horizon here. And I think the first one is around discrimination and exclusion. You know, we know that there's lots of discrimination and exclusion already in markets across the piece. But what digital services and technology allows firms to do is discriminate and exclude with even greater efficiency than we've seen before. It allows the market to discriminate with greater efficiency. And I think so that's the first challenge is to prevent exclusion, greater exclusion and discrimination. I think the second challenge is, and this is the thing we never really talk about, the rise in digital and data services really does allow the big tech providers to understand our behaviors in ways we don't even understand ourselves. And that allows them, working with financial services firms, to really manipulate our psychological and behavioral biases And I'm sure people will disagree, but I have to say that sort of the conduct of the big tech providers is not meaningfully regulated in this country in the same way big financial institutions are regulated. So there is no real safeguard in place to prevent digital and data services providers manipulating our behaviours and psychological biases. And then I think the third challenge, and Suzanne's more of an expert on this than myself, but we've seen the rise in scams and frauds that are all delivered online. But financial services and digital services and legal services share something in common. They're not physical goods, they're abstract goods and services. They can be sold from around the world. They are truly global in nature. And it makes it really, really difficult for domestic regulators, for example, based in the UK, to actually police the behaviours of digital providers that might be based somewhere else around the world. So I think that's the challenge, is really set up against some of the opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. Stephen, main opportunities or challenges for regulation in the age of technology?
So look, I'm a techno-optimist. I think that actually harnessed well, governed well, new technologies, products, business models have enormous potential to improve people's well-being, to support economic growth, whether we're talking medicine, law, finance. But I also think as part of that regulators play an incredibly important role in ensuring that people can have trust in technology and innovation. We're the people that give citizens confidence to download new apps, to try new services, safe in the knowledge that they are going to be protected. And to give you a recent example from the pandemic, the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation recently did a survey and found that governance of technology, trust in that, was the single biggest predictor of how comfortable people were about technology being used in the pandemic. Didn't matter how much they were worried about the pandemic, didn't matter how effective they thought the technology would be. The top criteria for them was actually that it was governed well. So I think there's two challenges that we really need to think of when we're thinking about sort of the pressures on regulation. One, I think it's for regulators, it's the challenge of keeping pace with innovation, making sure that we are remaining on the front foot, that we've got the mechanisms for making people want to engage with us and tell us about what's going on. So the ICO, for example, just like many other regulators, has a regulatory sandbox where people can test and trial and sort of play with new ideas. The other side of this is technology and innovation is cutting across lots of what I would describe as kind of traditional regulatory boundaries. So actually, where you may have been talking about legal services and you may have think, okay, I'll go to the Solicitors Regulation Authority. Actually, if we're talking about law tech, actually the implications cut across so many different regulatory regimes. And that's a real paradigm shift for us as regulators. It means that we've really got to think about how we work together.
Stefan, I wonder, are you a techno-optimist or are you of the Ulster variety?
So I literally have techno-optimist written down on the paper in front of me. So I am very much in that camp. But I think we need to be sort of really clearly focused on the challenges as well. So I'll start with those to begin. So the tech markets, I mean, there's a lot of them and they're moving really fast. And it's hard to understand the frontiers of innovation and technology. So just to pick a few that we're actively thinking about right now: consumer Internet of Things, a whole variety of different cloud infrastructures, quantum computing. Not only do we need to understand the tech, really crucially important is understanding the nature of the business models that might emerge from the tech as well. And then we need to very carefully marry across the two. And if we think about the kind of the context for this is, I mean, I think it's fair to say this is something that regulators have not historically been good at. If you think about the birth of mobile operating systems, if you think about social media and early Facebook acquisitions, there's been a number of questions asked, and I think there's a consensus that these are the right questions to be asking. Now, the second thing about technology is not just the speed, but it actually can be intrinsically hard to understand. So there's been a lot of focus on algorithms and them being complicated black boxes, but actually it goes even beyond that. If we start thinking about algorithmic systems as well, and we've been actively doing this, and I'll come to that. when we're actively going into firms and understanding how they're reviewing different elements of their platforms, there's a whole variety of different algorithms. There's manual review. These are really quite complicated systems, and indeed it goes beyond algorithms as well. So we'll come to the optimism, but I'll hit a couple more challenges as well. The hiring the right talent is actually, there's a number of challenges there. It's not actually quite as hard as some people might think. There's a lot of talent buys into our social missions that together we broadly have. But in particular, if we want to get people from big tech firms or with considerable private sector experience, so they've got subject knowledge matter of domains, that's particularly hard. So I've lost a couple of team members from my old FCA team to Google and Facebook, and they were fantastic. Now, first of all, we had fantastic talent, but the other thing is I'm not going to be able to get it back from Google and Facebook. And then the last thing is that coordination point that Stephen's already made. I do think that's a real challenge, and there'll be more time for some optimism, but I do want to hit a couple of optimistic notes. I'll come back to that later. The opportunity for regulators for using the technology innovation is really quite enormous. So the ability to automate what we're doing using machine learning and artificial intelligence ourselves or engineering software is really quite considerable. And I'll hit a number of examples later of what we're doing at the CMA. I mentioned about the selling the social mission, and this really makes a difference. So we've had technology people in now for 2.5 years at the CMA. We talked about the information asymmetry between us and firms. We've now got effectively a baloney detector. I had a different B word that was slightly less polite earlier, and this really makes a difference when we're opposite the firms. That right. My team members can jump in, and they're able to call baloney, and that really makes a difference. Right. I'll do one more point, Clive, and this is on when it comes to algorithms. So we absolutely should be worried about discrimination in these things. There's also a key point of algorithms is that by their absolute nature, they require a far greater degree of specificity than human beings. And we can access that data, we can understand those systems. So there's absolutely the opportunity, just focusing on discrimination and bond, there's the opportunity, if we have actually in some ways the right legal systems in place as well, for us to actually significantly reduce discrimination compared to what exists today.
Okay, I can see Mick shaking his head there. So we're going to get into this a little bit later on, but I want to go to Tracy first. From your position, Tracy, Director of Strategy and Innovation at the SRA, what do you see as the main opportunities or challenges? And is the SRA keeping up?
Well, we're certainly trying to. I would classify myself as a realistic optimist. So I think regulators need to be absolutely at the forefront of encouraging those they regulate to innovate, because it often does lead to really serious opportunities to deliver services differently. We all know that in the UK, not everybody even thinks about accessing a legal service when they need one. So actually that opportunity and the potential there is good. But I'm not a regulator for nothing. We wouldn't have regulation if everything in the world was rosy and everybody took opportunities to develop the market in a way that was good for consumers. So I think there's also an issue around building confidence and trust through information and education. Absolutely agree with what others have said on collaboration. There's no point every regulator having its own code of conduct on X, Y, or Z when actually we could all collaborate. The more we have regulatory sandboxes and things that are not just specific to one sector, but that actually over time we're answering similar questions in the same way and consistency, I think would build consumer confidence and trust much more. Financial services has probably been where we've seen greatest innovation and use of technology. So let's start from learning from some of that. Let's learn from what didn't go well and where there's been potential detriment or discrimination, and let's repeat it. People talk to me all the time about law tech, and I say the biggest thing about legal services, and it's not just in the UK, it's everywhere, is it's a very, very risk averse and cautious profession. So actually getting law tech adopted is probably a thing where it's not just a consumer pull, but there's going to have to be some element of understanding of what the framework is. Otherwise, the profession may not change. And I'd hate to see that it was only the bigger law firms who have an even bigger hold on the market because they've been able to adopt tech. So I think there's a role for us as a regulator in understanding those we regulate aren't all the same. And probably in legal services, there's a huge range of opportunities for some providers to get more involved in tech or not. But for me, the heart of it is you've got to be a realistic regulator. Yes, you're here to make sure innovation happens, but you're not here to say at any price we can allow X, Y, or Z. If you're going to be learning, you do that in an open source way, and you put the results out in the public domain in a very fair and even way. You can't skew it to one or other person just because they've got more access to data. That would be my sort of watchwords anyway.
All right. Okay. So let's be realistic then. Suzanne, I mean, frankly, how effective can domestic regulators ever be at dealing with technology in a digitally borderless world in which other jurisdictions are looking to be far less regulatory than perhaps we are here?
Yes, one of the striking features of regulation and regulators is its domesticity, and we are very pleased to be joined today by some of our national regulators. And even though there are cross-border initiatives, there are wider groupings for collaboration, ultimately these are limited by enforcement, by the fact that relevant entities operate in different jurisdictions. And on some of these very, very difficult issues, not all views are aligned about what needs to be done. But there is a further challenge, and this isn't the perennial issues in a new world. It's the fact that the internet is borderless. So those challenges of jurisdiction are compounded by the issues of an online world. And maybe we can gain some comfort by saying that issues such as data privacy, protection of consumer rights tend to be quite universal norms that we all share. What we have seen is that that's not necessarily the case, and where the other regulators or other governments may not ascribe to the same principles of the rule of law that we do, does that necessarily pose a threat? So maybe when it comes to protecting of human rights and those more fundamental challenges, that is probably the next stage of threat on how do we achieve these goals on a much broader landscape.
Yeah, I mean, Mick, does widespread technological advancement necessarily lead to greater access to services and inclusion for the public, or can it just perpetuate disadvantage?
I think it can, Clive. On the second point, I mean, look, of course, technology, if used properly, can make markets more efficient, and by definition, in theory, that should then include more people in the market. So there is some potential for some consumers to benefit from it. But I mean, let's be realistic about this. Now, I'll use two quick case studies to explain what I mean. On the financial inclusion side, people are excluded and discriminated in financial markets for two main reasons. One is poverty. They haven't got enough money to actually buy financial products and services. And the second main reason for exclusion is that the market determines who can and can't access the market and on what terms. So technology in and of itself and the use of data and algorithms and whatever is not going to really significantly address those problems, because with technology, don't forget in financial services like consumer credit and insurance markets, the essence of financial services is that financial providers profile consumers according to how profitable they are and how much of a risk they represent. Now, what technology does and what data does and what algorithms do, it actually allows the market to actually profile consumers to an even more granular level. So it actually makes it easier for firms to actually identify those consumers which they think are higher risk and those consumers which they think are sort of low profitability and therefore exclude them. So there is actually no real reason why technology per se will actually lead to greater inclusion. If anything, the chances are it will lead to more exclusion and discrimination because of the way markets just operate. Technology does not change the market principles of market-based delivery. And the second case study, I mean, the other thing I'm really interested in, I chair an anti-poverty charity called Z2K, and we give free legal advice to people who are being evicted or who've been sanctioned by the DWP in the social security system. Now, technology is not going to help those people because, for a very simple reason, they have got fewer rights. If you're a private renter, you've got fewer rights than someone who buys pet insurance or who gets on a train. If you have to rely on social security, you have fewer rights when you deal with the DWP than you have if you deal with your financial services company when you're buying pet insurance. So it's a question of rights. Technology in and of itself will not fundamentally alter the fact that the most vulnerable consumers in this country now have fewer rights and weaker protections than middle class consumers or middle class citizens. That's the fundamental problem there. And technology in and of itself will do little to address the rights deficit. We've got a great example. We've got a great chance to learn from the mistakes of the past. You know, I used to be on the board of the Financial Services Authority and the board of the Financial Conduct Authority. The way we're trying to regulate digital markets now is actually this. We're using the same mistakes we made with financial services 20 years ago. We're hoping that competition will actually constrain the behaviors of the big digital and data firms. We're hoping that digital education will empower consumers to take on the big providers and protect themselves. Take it from me, competition and financial education had almost no effect on actually controlling the behavior of financial institutions in the financial services market. It took the creation of a thing called the Financial Conduct Authority, which literally was set up to control the behaviors and the conduct of financial institutions. Unless we set something similar up to control the big digital and data providers, we are not going to sort of see any real protection for consumers. There's a massive, what we call a kind of a shadow land out there in the digital and data services markets, which actually few consumers understand. I can tell you few regulators understand, and the boards of financial companies which do now use digital services, they don't understand how that shadow land actually works. So unless we have a proper regulatory system that controls the behaviors and polices the conduct of those big digital providers, we're going to repeat the mistakes we made with financial services all those years ago. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Stephen, you began this discussion by saying you're a techno-optimist. Just listening to what Mick has been saying there brings some sunshine into our lives.
So look, I don't think that what I said earlier on is incompatible with what Mick has just set out there. Actually, I think that it's perfectly possible to be optimistic about where these things can take us, but pragmatic about the fact that actually we're only going to get there if regulators play a strong and steady role, give a guiding hand to the development of these technologies and markets. And let me assure you that the ICO is not kind of watching and waiting for things to develop, but it's an active regulator that is really trying to make sure that across a breadth of technological domains, whether we're talking about artificial intelligence, ad tech, end-to-end encryption, that actually technology is being employed in a way which is in the interests of citizens. I'm just kind of coming back to that point that we started to touch on a little bit earlier. It's a job that we have to do together. So no one regulator here holds all the cards. We need to make sure that we have ways of working among each other to try and exert the greatest effect. And that may mean collaborating, for example, across sectors. So we have at the ICO an innovation hub, which means that if you are, for example, approaching the Solicitors Regulation Authority on matters around law tech, for example, through the Legal Access Challenge, we have supported firms to make sure that they are integrating data protection considerations by default into the design of their new ideas and propositions. It means that we need to be quite agile in terms of thinking about how do we really fuse the regimes that we have to make sure that they are delivering in the best interests of the individual. So take competition and data protection, for example. We can talk about consumers, we could talk about data subjects, but ultimately it's the same people who want good outcomes, and we need to work together. So we've been working very closely with our counterparts in the Competition and Markets Authority, for example, to set out actually how are we going to work together and join up and sort of join forces to make sure that the regulation of digital markets is in the interests of citizens. And so, you know, I do have a streak of optimism that is coming through here. I am, however, very, very realistic about the nature of the challenge that is upon us.
I mean, given the sort of scope and the speed of technological change, Stefan, how important is it, as Stephen indicated there, for regulators to sort of reach across the aisle, as it were, and join up the dots and work together?
I do think working together is crucially important. As I said, consumers aren't thinking of things in this kind of siloed way that naturally sort of regulators have to by the nature of our objectives. And I think so. It's a bit of a mouthful, but there's the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, which is basically ourselves, Ofcom, the ICO, and the FCA. And I think through initiatives like this, we're really starting to be able to cooperate better together. Now, a really good example here is the Google Privacy Sandbox. So this is, you know, we've I think many of us in society are very concerned about the privacy aspects of digital advertising. So Google has come up with its own solution for that, and that obviously has some really good privacy benefits. But then when we start thinking about competition, well, you know, if Google's designing technology, we might be concerned that if it's designing that technology, it might favour some parties, namely Google. And so we've been very actively involved. So my team, I've got data scientists and engineers in my team, actively involved to make sure we understand that technology and working broadly, receiving many calls for inputs. But at the same time, we're working very closely with the ICO. And in fact, one thing I would say I think would be really beneficial was if we could have more. So, you know, technically, this is a CMA project. We're working with the ICO. It'd be much better if we could more actively cooperate and even, obviously, with the right kind of constraints, share data for appropriate things so that we can really have the impact that I think that we would all like to have.
Yeah, really, really important point there. I mean, Tracy, do you believe that sort of regulators and public bodies, they actually have to understand how a particular technology works to be expert in innovation themselves in order to regulate its use?
I don't think we need to be expert or cutting edge, but we need to be in front of what's happening. So you can never take your eye off the ball, is what I would say. And we are active in doing research, trying to evidence-base what we do. All regulators have to be guided by principles. I'm here to protect the public interest, and that's often a very hard thing to define. To do that, I don't necessarily need more data scientists, but I need enough insight and knowledge to be able to police what's happening in an ever-changing world. And I think that's, again, comes back to some of the principles we've already discussed. It's about collaboration. We have a thing called the SRA Innovate Space, where people come to us with early stage ideas, and we, without damning or giving a yes or no answer, we are aware then of what's happening in the market. We try to put out more information all the time, not just about where something's gone wrong and where we've had to do enforcement action, but about the kind of things that the profession is coming to us and saying, would this be acceptable? Would this work? Would this be a detriment, or what have you? We're capturing that. The other thing I'd say is the more we can work closely with governments. So governments publish innovation strategies. We've had one recently from the Department for Business. All of that sort of stuff. Coordination is what's going to stop some of the detriments that Mick's touched on. Because if we all just keep repeating the same mistakes, nobody benefits, and we don't benefit in terms of our reputation as regulators. And my objective is to ensure that progress is made in a substantive enough way that doesn't leave people way behind, or people almost traumatized by the speed of change so that they're in denial. And it's just a very hard one to get the balance right. But for me, it's that balance that's going to make the difference. You don't want to be streets ahead of the game, and you don't want to be streets behind. You want to be where the majority are. And probably, and it pains me to say it after such an awful time with the COVID pandemic, we've probably seen a greater shift of more people of all age groups into digital than ever before. So probably the pressure on us as regulators to keep up with that, it's probably been a very timely reminder that we do have to keep the pace. And sometimes change will come in the strangest ways. What's that phrase? Sometimes it takes a really, really significant external event to make what looks like a reasonably small change. But we're probably never going to go backwards now in terms of consumers wanting services digitally. So for every regulator in every sector, we've got to keep up.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, Suzanne, I just wonder, though, if the public would expect the regulator to be not just at least on top of the technological changes that are going on within their particular sector, but actually would expect you to be ahead of the curve if you're going to be able to regulate and protect the public itself.
Well, one plea I would urge all regulators is the plea for curiosity and understanding, because certainly a complaint of the beneficiaries of regulation and also regulated parties is the regulator may not have enough understanding of the real world realities. My day job as a barrister is standing up, cross-examining people in court, and I have to get my head around the details of it, else I can't ask intelligent questions. That doesn't mean I need to be a computer programmer or the next whiz in AI, but having that agility of mind to first understand, in my view, is what is needed to develop proportionate and appropriate regulation that really matters. And if we see the regulation as driving better performance, better standards, and better outcomes, I think it's only by looking really about what do we want to achieve and how can we do it with these challenges.
Stephen, I mean, what challenges does the potential growth in online automated services, for example, those delivered through online algorithms, self-serve or chatbots, what do they pose for regulators?
Oh, I mean, there is a huge suite of challenges, and we at the ICO have been thinking naturally about these for some time, but actually they're challenges that are going to cut across nearly every single regulator, and we work very, very closely with a range of different regulators on the implications of AI. But challenges like the transparency of its use, challenges around the accuracy of what's going in, what's coming out, challenges of where decisions are being taken in an entirely automated way, without what people would describe as a human in the loop, who is able to intervene when something is going wrong. That visibility of kind of how the system is working. Challenges, from a data protection perspective around just how much data is being consumed, people's awareness of kind of how their data is being used by these systems, and their ability, therefore, to exercise their own rights around protecting their data. And that means that we need to do both the proactive outreach, that sort of leaning in and setting the tone about actually what are our expectations. And we've been doing this for some time in terms of setting out not just kind of our guidance on matters like how to explain the outcomes of algorithms to the public, but actually also giving industry practical tools like their own sort of auditing frameworks that they can use to make sure that they are developing algorithms in an appropriate way. But it also means that we have to be equally agile in thinking about, well, where are we going to take action, and where are we going to be able to intervene on this? And as the data protection regulator, the challenge that that we see around kind of not just frankly artificial intelligence, but many new technologies is what I would describe as invisible harms, things where people don't know that they are getting worse outcomes, so they aren't able to flag it to us. And that is a real challenge. So we need to use all those sources of intelligence. We need to work really closely with our counterparts, both domestically and internationally as well. And that's a strand that we've touched on just briefly sort of earlier, but it's going to be so important as we go forward, because if you are looking at AI, for example, you are thinking about how the algorithms are developed, what populations they're developed on, what's the supply chain of those things across borders. We're going to have to work really closely together.
Sure. So, Stefan, then, I mean, how do you regulate a bot? How do you regulate a machine? I mean, is it possible to make algorithms fairer in making their decisions? And as Stephen pointed out just then, setting the tone for the person making the algorithm is fine, and you lean in trying to influence how they behave. But the crucial point is, when do you decide that you're going to get actually actively involved and say enough is enough?
So on that last point on the human in the loop, I think it really makes massive difference what the nature of the decision is. There's many areas where I think it's really important that we actually have humans in the loop all the time. Stuff to do with health, stuff to do with access to social services, things like this. We always need to make sure very actively that humans are in the loop. For other things, we're all of us on the panel, all of us who are watching today, will have interacted with algorithms. My guess is several, a dozen times today at least, right? Just the sheer nature of using technology. And of course, in many of these, we're not going to have humans in the loop. And actually, having a human in the loop would not be able to consume those services in the way that actually we'd want to consume those services. So we have to really watch out for things. I mean, by the nature of sort of digital, by the nature of things bringing us to digitally, we're going to need algorithms in terms of that. Now, it's absolutely clear that algorithms can sometimes perpetuate biases that already exist in data, and under certain conditions can even actually create biases that don't exist. Moreover, actually Mick gave some examples in sort of financial services where an ability to kind of discriminate here wouldn't necessarily be on protected characteristics, might be other forms of just focusing on profit. You might find that there's less access. But there's also a few things that we need to bear in mind in the opposite. So certainly in the US, one of the findings is actually fintech firms in particular actually have been bringing more people into the mainstream. So actually the technology has found that they've actually been able to access more firms, access more people. Moreover, as I said earlier, there's because of the nature of the way that algorithms work, there has to be a specificity. And that means actually that we all will have strong legal data gathering powers. So right now, one of our consumer cases, we're working with a number of firms, and we've actually been getting right into their algorithms. In some cases, literally getting the algorithms of firms. In other cases, just getting very, very detailed documentation. And at the same time of algorithms being used, there's been a huge increase in the understanding of algorithms and how do you audit algorithms. So I do think, actually, I think there's many other areas of technology we need to be focused on. But one area of technology we really need to be focused on is making sure that we have those capabilities ourselves. So that's one thing. So I mentioned my data scientists and engineers. One thing we've really focused on is building up that algorithmic analysis capability. We actually published a paper in January about really trying to understand those harms, which, as we said earlier, some of them may not be clearly observed. We need to understand those harms really clearly, build up our knowledge, and then build up the techniques in order to deal with that.
Sure. Mick, I suspect your point would be that that expertise isn't there at the moment. and that the geeks are running away with the show, and the regulators are having trouble keeping up.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, look, to sort of mix me classical metaphors, we're not going to put the genie back in the bottle. Pandora's box has been opened, and all the things have flown out, so we can't close that. But a couple of years ago, we published a paper called Fintech, Beware of Geeks Bearing Gifts, and we tried to sort of explain to people that just because it's technology, just because it sounds exciting, doesn't mean you should be evangelical about the whole thing. There's a lot of risks that are actually coming with this. And I think I'll tell you what really worries me, Clive, actually, is, as I say, I think there's striking parallels here with financial services. I've been around long enough to remember, 1997, in the run up to the big financial crisis in 2008, politicians and regulators were arguing for light touch regulation because they didn't want to stifle innovation, and the growth in financial services. Where did that get us? It brought us the 2008 financial crisis. My concern now is that if you read every single political document, every regulatory document, they're all just, beside themselves almost with excitement about the potential for fintech and innovation and so on. And that's great. It will bring some benefits, as I said, but they really mustn't lose sight of the significant risks that will come with it. I mean, I didn't even get into the risk of harms being replicated in the system much quicker than in the sort of the pre-digital days and the old analog markets. So there's a sort of a systemic risk as a result of the growth in digital services as well. But look, it's not a counsel of despair. These things can be regulated, and even though the technology or the algorithms may be complicated, don't forget pharmaceuticals are very complicated. Financial services is incredibly complicated. Nuclear energy is even more complicated, but we don't sort of stand back and say, well, we'll never regulate that. What we do is, instead of, as well as trying to regulate the technology, which is difficult because of the jurisdictional issues, what we do is we regulate the people. We regulate the people who are in charge of developing the technology. But more importantly, I think this is the really important point, is that we regulate the people who use the technology, whether that's in a financial services company, in a pharmaceutical company, in a utility company. If you pin the responsibility on the guys, primarily guys who sit on the boards of financial services companies, utility companies, pharmaceutical companies, or legal services companies, or whatever, if you pin the responsibility on them to use the technology for good, that's when you get traction. That's when you get them to sit up and take notice. And there's a famous thing called the precautionary principle as well, is that you be pragmatic about things. You just don't assume that technology and innovation creates social utility. You actually be pragmatic about it, and you use the precautionary principle to actually guide the use of technology. So it's not a counsel of despair. Learn from financial services. We need a proper digital conduct authority, similar to the Financial Conduct Authority, to control the behaviours of the people who run digital and data services. It can be done.
Yeah. I mean, Tracy, I saw you nodding along to a lot of that. Is there a sense that there is a lot that can be learned from the situation with the financial services sector over the last few years? And this goes back to the first session we had today, that difficult balance between protecting consumers but allowing technology and innovative new ideas to flourish.
Yeah, I mean, that's the absolutely prize here, isn't it? You can't be, as a regulator, naive. You've got to have a certain skepticism, but equally we are here to foster better outcomes. And the reality in the UK is that many people don't even begin to think about taking a legal service advice when they need it. So potentially it's a big prize if we get it right. I've been reassured in recent times in my role in the job. I joined from another regulator where we used to regulate audit and accounting at the Financial Reporting Council. And actually, I was reassured that some of the risks that you can mitigate through use of AI in terms of how people are aware of what tools are being used and when, and how people then verify those results and cross-reference and so on can be done. The other parallel for legal services that I don't think we talk about enough is probably medtech. And actually, there will never be a better parallel to taking advice from a lawyer lawyer as there is from taking advice from a medical professional. And Mick identified just now that can be a very powerful kind of form of regulation. So it's not just the rules-led regulation; it's a behavioural and cultural approach to regulation. And this is probably where my super optimism comes in. But I think the UK can lead on this, because I think our professional culture and the rule of law and all of these things that as citizens we kind of take for granted, possibly in a post-COVID world, of taking on even more importance. And I'm struck, I have teenage daughters, they're much more driven by issues like sustainability, climate change, things that need principle and sharing of knowledge and so on. So if we can manage to get all of those things together, and for the tech companies to have a sense of social responsibility that really is apparent, and for legal firms and all the other professions who say they have an ESG philosophy or program or mantra, to start making it apparent in some of these new service provision, then that could be potentially brilliant. It could be brilliant for all of us as citizens and brilliant for the UK standing in the world and so on. So I think we can strive for it, but I do agree with Mick in particular, it's not easy. For us as regulators not to talk about the downsides. If we were just on autopilot, it's all going to be fantastic. I don't think that would help build consumer trust either. And I don't think it helps those we regulate in the long run. We've all got to be in it together. And a final plea from me is more and more of the regulated community, you need to talk to your regulators. So we've just done a thing at the SRA that we're very proud of, which is these piloting quality indicators. So it was a CMA recommendation. We work closely with colleagues in the ICO, and we've got some small law firms who would have probably struggled to make lots of investment in new technology to work with a lot of the online tool providers. So people like Trustpilot, and we've all done it together in collaboration in a pilot basis, and we're learning as we go, and we're sharing those learnings. Those kind of approaches, rather than just a traditional sandbox, which can seem quite technical for some people, might also work. And the more we do that kind of activity across regulators and public policy development, that might be just a way forward. Thanks.
I mean, Stephen, I wonder, is it actually easier for those in non-regulated areas to develop and introduce innovative approaches? And does that create the risk that regulated businesses and organizations could end up being left behind?
Well, I'd start by sort of asking you kind of name a business that isn't regulated. If you are using technology or processing personal data, you are regulated by us. If you are growing to a size where you are having an impact on the market in a dominant fashion, the eyebrows will start to raise at the Competition and Markets Authority. It is hard to find any business that does not fall within a regulatory remit. I wanted to come back to the point raised by Mick about the sort of this regulatory optimism and enthusiasm for new technology, and just provide a note of reassurance here. There's a kind of a mantra in my team. We do not sacrifice privacy at the altar of innovation. We do not. We are set up to ensure that we are protecting the public interest, just as Tracy said. What protecting the public interest for us means is finding ways to influence these different firms, and that means trying to find what I would describe as upstream ways of influencing. So trying to find ways to get the whole economy to want to engage with us, to find out about what the rules are and regulations are that apply to them, and to implement those. And we have, as the ICO, we are a cross-economy regulator. We have to take that influence thing on board at the same time as being really clear about what our expectations are and what we will do if our expectations are not met. And I agree with what Mick says, actually, around the real importance of good governance and accountability, of making sure that there is actually clear roles in terms of who is responsible, where the buck stops around things, and that there is kind of appropriate attention to compliance, to having the right models in place for checking that everything is kind of going on okay and it to plan. And when we're talking about things like algorithmic processing, that is especially important, because the risk of getting to a point where nobody quite understands what is going on is very high. And just to kind of refer back to the other sectors that were kind of referenced, if you were talking to a nuclear business and they said, oh, actually no, we don't really understand what's happening inside the reactor at the moment, that would be quite a large cause for concern. And so, we need to have that accountability. We need to have that understanding of how these things are working at the right level.
I mean, final point really, is there a sort of no man's land, or there is no Wild West out there where the long arm of regulation doesn't reach? There are completely regulated sectors all the way across our society. Is that really true?
No, it's not true, because look, I hate to be sort of a bit of a policy nerd here, but I think we're talking across purposes here, because I think Stephen's talking about data privacy and data protection, which is incredibly important. What I'm talking about is how our data is used and the conduct and the behaviors of the firms who use our data. And that is a very, very different thing when you think about it, And I would argue, for example, that, the big tech platforms like Google and Amazon and the rest of them, and a lot of the sort of the information and data brokers are not actually regulated at all when it comes to their conduct. They might be regulated when it comes to data privacy and actually owning our data, but there is no equivalent. Trust me, there is no equivalent to the standards that are expected of financial services firms, because of the Financial Conduct Authority. There is no equivalent requirements of big tech firms and other digital and data services providers when it comes to how that data is used to manipulate our behaviors. Good example was these buy now, pay later firms. Now they may be regulated for data privacy firms, but they were not regulated under consumer protection regulation, which means that market has grown up out of almost nowhere and created huge harm because they weren't regulated for their conduct. Very different thing. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna give the last word to Stephen just to respond to that, because we've run out of time.
So I'm just to say, absolutely. There are areas always where the development of new technologies puts pressure not just on regulators but on the legislative framework. We can only operate within the legal framework that we've got, and there would be no pressure on governments to reform the legal framework if there were not kind of gaps that were emerging. And we've seen that in areas like online safety, for example, and the government's announced plans to make sure that actually there is a new regime to tackle challenges around online safety, where there was none before. So yes, we all need to be alert to those problems, but some of those problems I am both relieved and saddened to say are for government rather than for regulators.
All right, I'm going to end our discussion there. Thanks to our fantastic panel. Really, really interesting for bringing your insight to all of this. I have to say, it's been an amazing series of sessions we've had throughout the day, really. Lots of insights, lots of questions from all of you watching. Your contributions has been invaluable. I suppose one overarching theme has been not just the nature of the role of regulators, but how involved that role should be. Light touch, right touch. Regulators should be adding value, one panelist said. Their responses should be proportionate. But in the field of equality and inclusion, should perhaps regulators be tougher, stronger? Some might argue that might be the case. But how does technology muddy the waters? Can our regulators catch up, keep pace with the lightning changes, and crucially, promote public confidence and trust in businesses and services, whatever sector they may be, whether you're a realistic optimist, a super optimist, a techno optimist. We've all got to be optimistic about the future and about the role that regulators can play in promoting healthy futures for all of us. And it's been interesting to see the similarities between so many different sectors, but understand how they can learn from each other and come together when necessary to promote better understanding of the work of the different regulatory bodies. Well, the SRA wants to know your views on how you found today's virtual event. There is a link below. You can see it there where you can offer your feedback through a short evaluation. The SRA will also be sending emails to get your thoughts. It would be great if you could take just a couple of minutes to complete it. It would really help with the planning of future events. Tracy, Mick, Stefan, Stephen, Suzanne, it's been brilliant having you on. Thank you so much for your input. It's been fascinating. And to all of you for watching, it's been great to be with you. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thanks to you too, Clive. Thank you. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye.